Hola, ¿cómo estás? Good morning, good afternoon, somewhere. Good night.
Welcome back to another episode of KimYaps. For my Spotify audience, you can't see me right now uh, because I'm not seen. But YouTube, obviously, this was recorded the same day as the last episode. But welcome back to another episode, y'all. So, in today's title, it's just called Cultural Inheritance, the generational weight that holds our growth back. Now, why did I pick this title? Because YouTube suggested it, and I just did some research. Uh, but this is something that I've been pondering for a while, and I think part of the reason that I have been sitting with it for so long is because the subject, it's one of those things that goes back, or that kind of like feels older than language. It feels like one of those things you sense before you can necessarily explain it. You can feel it in a room before you hear it in sentence. And I think a lot of us have lived that way. We have felt old weights in young bodies. We have felt reactions rise up that seem too deep for the moment in front of us. A small disagreement happens and your whole body tightens. Somebody gets quiet and suddenly something in you starts preparing for something as tragic as loss. And opportunity opens up, and instead of joy, your first instinct is caution, guard up, essentially putting your heart on ice, right? And after enough years of moving like that, a person starts calling that awareness, knowledge, some branched out version of protecting your peace. Personality, right? That's how I love, that's how I protect myself. That's just how my people are. And maybe some part of it is personality. Some part of it may be our own version of temperance. Some of it is real different just between individuals. But I have a certain idea that some of us have been carrying, not necessarily carrying, but more or less have inherited baggage from previous generations, right? Old grief, scarcity, pride, silence, old ways of seeing the world that came through households that had gone through certain things like the civil rights movement, abuse, trauma, and the certain things that run the world and eventually became so normal for us, we eventually got told to call it character. And there's a specific word, or a phrase rather, cultural inheritance, right? Now, I'm not talking about some of the parts that get this down, like the fact that I have rhythm, or well, some of us don't have rhythm. I ain't gonna lie, some of y'all chocolate black, no shade, but I'm also not talking about like certain recipes or language, style, music, memory, and certain things like resilience. I am also talking about this idea of emotional inheritance, relational inheritance, survival inheritance, the patterns that get handed to people through repetition, through atmosphere, through what a child sees every day until it starts feeling like the reality of the structure itself. It's the part where psychology, language, and intergenerational trauma starts to coincide. It gives a name to something that people have felt for a long time. Trauma or its legacy can sometimes be passed from one generation to another, and sometimes, of course, as we study here, when public health people talk about adverse childhood experiences, they explain it that potentially traumatic experiences in childhood can carry long-term consequences for health, opportunity, well-being. But they make a specific point these harms are shaped by more than one thing at a time. They could be shaped by the individual, the relationship, community, and societal factors, which means that the conversation that we're having is bigger than blaming just one person in the house. So, say if you have a disagreement or you have some bitterness towards your father, mother, cousin, auntie, brother, it isn't just closed in to that one person. It's a system, rather a pyramid scheme of trauma that has been passed down. So, because of that, I think for me, I don't necessarily look at behavior anymore. I look for the area around the behavior, the certain whys of the matter, the history beneath the behavior. I look for what a person might have had to gone through to become the person that they are, whether those are good things or bad things. And like with every family has a theology of anger, a theology of money, closeness, apology, manhood, womanhood, a theology of what happens when somebody cries, a theology of how much people can stop acting like everything is okay. Because for some of us, we grew up in households that taught us that our feelings do have somewhere to go. But other people grew up in places where they learned that feelings are expensive, that they cost, and that your feelings aren't just your own, but they're everybody else's. And you yourself are responsible for how you feel, because if you were to expose how you feel, you would somehow endanger everyone else in the room. Some children learn that honesty can open doors. Some learn that it changes the whole weather of the home. So they start to do this thing, which for my editors, they would start to edit themselves early. Some children learn that love comes with steadiness, and others learn that love arrives hot and leaves cold. So their nervous system starts calling unpredict- unpredictability normal. And that's the weird thing, because people think inheritance happens through what? Lectures, spoken values, direct instruction. But to tell the truth, a lot of the deepest versions of inheritance happens through certain things like tone, timing, facial expressions, through how long tension might sit in the air, or how long, say, if one of your brothers, sisters, they get mad at you, you can kind of feel the anger around them, the way they rush past you and don't look at you, the way they hold a bag or move up their shoulders to get past you, right? Through that, we also learn how repair is welcome. We learn how certain people will move past an issue by ignoring it until they feel like you're worthy enough to talk to again, dismissing the whole situation because they don't feel comfortable, or rather, they don't know how to express themselves without some form of abandonment, right? And the thing about that is, we know that and we understand that, but we often see it as, okay, this is something that we're going through. But we rarely look at what's happening on the ground level. We're rarely looking down. And the children are watching all of that. They are reading the room all the time, even when they don't have the right words to explain what they're saying. Article in Samsung put it pretty plainly. Young people's reactions to trauma are influenced by how parents, relatives, teachers, and caregivers respond. I think NIMH says something similar. The adults in the room shape the child's response. So the lesson is never only the event itself. The lesson is also what the event teaches the body about the world after it happens. That means a child can learn things like vigilance without anybody ever saying be vigilant. A child can learn emotional distance without anybody ever delivering a speech on emotional distance. And worst of all, the child can learn that affection sometimes is unstable, and sometimes that their usefulness is safer than their honesty. That being needed keeps you closer to people. So now, what do you make from that? You create a child that's whole worldview, its identity is built around overfunctioning, overgiving, overcaring, staying strong, staying available, staying productive, staying composed. Then years pass, the child grows up. Everybody starts to applaud how adaptable they were to the world that they had not had the chance to influence its building. Certain things like that. Look how mature they are. That's a solid young man. Look how much she does. Look how independent they are. Look how calm they are. They're all so private. They don't say nothing. Look how disciplined they are. And often, it's a double-edged sword because we try to, even in this new language with trauma healing and stuff like that, we try to address and try to fixate on all the crimes that have been dealt. But to tell the honest truth, and sadly at that, some of the traumas that we've been dealt made us better people. I used to say this very odd statement, I still do, that trauma builds champions, and that everything that we go through in this life is some level of character development in whichever movie or story that we're being written into. And we can look at certain people like, let's say, what's that one Will Smith movie about the dude that was the computer man? He was broke with his son, and they had to sleep in bathrooms. They had to do all this crazy stuff. But he kept on pursuing. He kept on being resilient. He kept on pushing forward. Did he put his son in a very weird position as a child that might have negatively impacted him from the future? Yes. But he also taught him a discipline and a resilience that he'll never forget. And that is the double-sided nature of this. Survival builds real muscle. Endurance is real. Self-control is real. Keeping yourself alive through certain trials and tribulations is real. But some of what gets praised is still people in the emergency room wearing dress clothes. Some people get rewarded for living in a state of brace. And some people get celebrated for becoming emotionally unreachable because of their culture, their family, their environment, their circle. And mostly because their circle had no category for a whole person, only one that could be used by them. And that's the part of it that kind of disturbs me, because being raised by a Gen Xer, you realize that they had a troubling childhood, because their lives are kind of fixated on this point of how useful can I be? How can this person be useful to me? And a kind of backwards version of slavery. What I think happened was, like, the people, at least like my grandmothers and your grandmothers or great grandmothers for some of you, generation, they were raised by the slavery parents. So they were just kind of like, oh my gosh, we don't know what's happening, yada, 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 but we're going to teach you. We're going to try to do this. and they were trying to become heavy overachievers, right? And in the face of that, in their overachieving nature, they sort of dismissed their children. And in dismissing their children, they had allowed for them to kind of, well, for some did, allow them to self raise themselves. And in that self raising, they missed some parts of key information from their parents that could have been extremely useful. And because their parents saw them less as a child, sometimes and more as a utility, and this is specifically for some, and I'm targeting the black demographic of overachievers, bunch of degrees, CEOs at the top of the company rate, that's being held up by rich white folks and stuff like that, right? Because they're in that generation, what do their parents view them as? They view them as certain kinds of slaves. And not slaves in the worst way you could say it, but slave in the version of, hey, why aren't you doing this thing wrong? Beat you. Hey, good job at doing this. Now do this. Now do this. Now do this. Now raise your other brothers and sisters. Now do this. Now do this. They treat you and they rear you to become very functioning slaves, which makes you great for the job market. That is also why that 90s, they was in their prime in the 90s generation was so high motored, kind of waiting to be free, because what is the greatest thing that Abe Lincoln never did for the slaves to help them to get free? But once they had that freedom, they didn't necessarily know what to do with it, because the foundation that was supposed to be set, the precedent that was supposed to be set by the parents, was in some ways ignored. And they were multi-talented because in those households, they had to become functional fast. They had to become readable fast, helpful fast, tough fast, quiet fast, impressive, funny, all these certain things. So so they can also become stable on command. If somebody in the house is rescuing, they become the rescuer. If somebody in the house can't tolerate truth, you adjust yourself so you could become the one that smooths everything over. If the house is exploding, you become the one who disappears inside yourself. And the reason why I'm addressing this situation, the reason why I'm coming back to this, is because I think one of the saddest things in the world is when a person mistakes survival posture for a personality trait and then defends it for the rest of their life. I'm just like this. I need space. I just don't trust people. I just get irritated fast. I just do better on my own. I just keep my feelings to myself. I just expect the worst, and that keeps me safe. And sometimes there is wisdom in a person learning caution. Sometimes caution is something that's needed, but sometimes we call wisdom old fear that became very articulate, philosophy, if you will. Sometimes we call standards. Sometimes what we call standards is just really ungrieved hurt with nice clothes on. Sometimes what we call privacy is pain that never found a safe house. Sometimes what we call hustle is just panic with a calendar. Now, the phrase that keeps coming to me while talking about all of this is emotional depth. So, what a lot of families do is they pass down emotional depth from grief that never was addressed, from humiliation, poverty, violence, betrayal, that taught people that intimacy was something that had to be essentially stolen in order to be had. That from certain things like racism, displacement, instability, addiction, abandonment, shame. Everything people had to survive in order to keep the family moving. And then the really screwed up part about that is that the next generation after them gets handed the bill. So now you have people paying for wounds that they did not originally open. Some people carrying moves that they don't fully understand. People staying loyal to broken patterns because those patterns are tied up with memory, with belonging, with family honor, with cultural familiarity, with grief, with love, heck, with the ancestors. And that is why the conversation needs to be had, because the goal isn't to become arrogant and to act like the people before us were fools. A lot of our people were trying to breathe under crushing conditions. Um, we we talk about all day about slavery, racism, certain things like that, but we don't necessarily understand what it meant to go through all of that. The reason why we have so much of what we have now as a culture, specifically referring to the black race, is because of the pain that we went through. For those of y'all that don't have rhythm, probably some of y'all were in the house. I'm just playing. But it's like the Bible says, to whom much is given, much is expected. There, in order to be a dominant, one has to live a life of cursed submission. And that was the plight of the black race, where we had to cope in that area of constant berating, death, tribulation, time, of just desperation, the crying out of the children and the mothers and the fathers that were hanging from trees. And to be honest, it just collapses from one generation to the other. Certain things like speaking the truth, um, rejecting, opening up. These are all things that truly do originate from slavery. I mean, when we think about how we act in a certain regard when it comes to life, within how we approach certain things, doesn't that sound like we're being controlled by a slave master that only wants us to show a little bit of skin, and even in that little bit of skin, it still has to be controlled? Think about that. I want you to think about your emotional tendencies, the things you say, the things you don't let slip out. And I want you to look at those things, and I want you to see if you saw that in another person, the certain things that you do, what would you think about that person? Now, if I told you that person was being ruled over, had an overseer, would it make sense? Or would it come back like, oh, what are you talking about? Of course, that person is just normal. Now, if you said that person is just normal, then you've proven my point. Because that is the normalcy now. The normalcy is to feel conflicted in your own freedom, which is very strange. Now, there is evidence that trauma across generations can echo through family systems, caregiving patterns, social conditions, chronic stress, and attachment. There is active research on biological pathways too, including epigenetic mechanisms that are associated with trauma across generations. At the same time, the better reviews keep warning about talking about this like fate got tattooed in your DNA forever. In humans, the science is still complicated, by shared environment. So what I'm really saying is, even in your DNA, even in your gene pattern, even in the things that are supposed to be kind of yours, you don't really own them either. The um the idea is the whole idea of you being handcrafted and being molded with your own unique characteristics is true, but it's not the whole truth. It's only half of it. It's part of it. Yes, you're perfectly and wonderfully made, but you have been pushed into a world where you're carrying more than you expected. You were born to be born into water, yet the water has salt, it has goo in it, it has things that were never meant to be in a child's presence. And now you're forced to handle that. And sometimes I wonder, like I often wonder, when does it end? When does this cycle of trauma, of being always in this state of being discontent, when does it stop? Some people says it stops with God, but he told us we were going to be lost.